It's that universal, gut-wrenching nausea of I wasn't there when she needed me. It sits in the pit of the stomach like a stone swallowed whole, heavy and cold, dragging the spirit down into the mud. He can shut down an international airport with a single phone call. He can make a federal judge disappear before his morning coffee cools. But standing here, on this rain-slicked street, under the indifferent and flickering glow of the city lights, looking at the split lip of the woman he loves, he has never felt more small. It is the crushing realization that you can rule the world. You can command armies of men who would die at your snap. But it means absolutely nothing if you weren't there to shield her from the storm. He cleaned her face with hands that were shaking. They were not shaking from anger, though the rage was there, a dormant volcano beneath the surface. They were shaking from the weight of letting her down. A normal husband, a man who works a 9 to 5 and pays his taxes, has to swallow that guilt. He has to call the police and wait for help that might never come. But as Alejandro Vargas stands with her in the pouring rain, the city holds its breath. The thunder rolling over the mountains seems to pause, waiting for his reaction, because he doesn't call the police. In this city, he owns the police. He is the law, and tonight, the law is out for blood. The rain in Bogota is relentless. It does not wash things clean. It only makes the grime slicker, reflecting the neon sins of the city back into the eyes of the men who run it. The water dripped from the brim of his dark hair, running down the sharp, aristocratic planes of his face, mingling with the droplets on her skin. She was shivering. It was a small, violent tremor that started deep in her shoulders and rattled through her entire frame, vibrating against his chest where he held her close. He could feel it through the soaked silk of his suit jacket, a terrifying Morse code tapping out the word fear against his own ribs. Every shudder was an indictment of his power. Every tremble was a testament to his failure. He didn't ask who, not yet. To ask was to admit that he didn't already know. And Alejandro Vargas made it his business to know the movement of every sparrow in this city, let alone the movements of the wolves. He simply looked at the mark. It was a bruise, blooming like a dark, violent violet orchid across her cheekbone. The delicate skin broken at the center where a ring or a heavy knuckle had made contact. The blood had dried and then been wetted again by the rain, creating a thin pink streak that ran down to her jawline like a macabre tear. "Let's go," he whispered. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the hiss of tires on wet pavement and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the city nightlife. He didn't sound like a monster. He sounded like a husband. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing about him in that moment. The monster would have screamed. The monster would have drawn the gun tucked into the waistband of his trousers and fired blindly into the dark shadows of the alleyway. But the husband was quiet, and the husband was calculating. The husband was storing this image of her broken face in the vault of his mind, fuel for the fire that would consume the city by morning. He guided her toward the waiting car, a black armored SUV that looked like a phantom idling at the curb. The back door was already open, held by a man who looked at the ground, refusing to make eye contact with either of them. The security detail knew. They knew they had failed. They knew that the only reason they were still breathing was that Alejandro's focus was entirely consumed by the woman trembling under his arm. If he looked away from her, even for a second, he might see them. And if he saw them, he would have to kill them. So they looked at the asphalt, statues of regret and fear, as the king and his injured queen passed by. Inside the car, the silence was heavier than the humidity outside. The leather creaked as they settled in. The door closed with a solid, hermetic thud, sealing them away from the noise of the street, cutting off the sirens and the music and the shouts of the city. Instantly, the sound of the rain became a distant drumming on the reinforced roof, a muted backdrop to the sound of her uneven, hitched breathing. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a pristine, white handkerchief. He didn't look at it. His eyes were fixed on her face, tracing the damage, memorizing the topography of her pain. He lifted the cloth and very gently, with a tenderness that belied the lethal strength in his fingers, dabbed at the cut on her lip. She flinched. The movement was slight, a tiny recoil, but it hit him like a physical blow to the gut. It stopped his heart for a beat. She was afraid. Not of him. Never of him, he prayed. But the adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, making her body react to any touch as a threat. Her instincts were wired for survival now, and that broke him more than the bruise itself. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice was broken, raspy, as if she had been screaming or holding back screams for hours. "I'm so sorry, Alejandro." The apology shattered him. It stripped away the layers of his composure. He stopped moving, his hand hovering near her cheek, the white cloth stained with a single drop of her blood. She was apologizing. She, the victim, was apologizing to him, the man whose very existence was the reason this happened. "Why?" he asked, his voice straining against the lump in his throat. "Why are you sorry, mi vida?" "Because I know what you're going to do," she said, her eyes finding his. They were wide, glassy, with tears that hadn't fallen yet, reflecting the passing streetlights. "I know what this means. I just wanted to walk. I just wanted to be normal for an hour. I didn't think..." "Shh." He moved his hand to the back of her neck, his thumbs stroking the damp hair there, feeling the frantic pulse of her carotid artery. "It is not your fault that the world is dark, Elena. It is my fault for not burning it bright enough to keep you safe. It is my fault for thinking I could keep the wolves at bay while I slept." He pulled her into him then, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed her in. She smelled of rain, of metallic ozone, of fear, and faintly of the vanilla perfume she always wore, a scent that usually signaled home, comfort, and peace. But tonight, that scent signaled only how close he had come to losing his home. He felt her hands clutch the lapels of his jacket, gripping the expensive fabric so tight her knuckles turned white. She held onto him as if he were a cliff edge, and she was dangling over the abyss. The car moved smoothly through the traffic, a shark swimming through a school of minnows. Alejandro looked out the tinted window. The city passed by in a blur of lights, red, yellow, white. Bogota, his city. He had built it, in a way. He had paved these roads with gold and blood. He had decided which politicians sat in the high offices and which ones ended up in the trunks of cars at the bottom of the river. He thought he owned it. He thought he had domesticated the beast. But tonight, the beast had bitten the hand that fed it. The realization settled in his stomach like cold lead. This wasn't a random mugging. Muggers didn't hit women wearing diamond earrings and leave the diamonds. He looked down at her ear. The stones were still there, glittering in the semi-darkness, mocking him with their sparkle. Muggers didn't strike the wife of Alejandro Vargas unless they had a death wish or unless they were sent. This was a message. Someone had looked at the impregnable fortress of his power, searched for a crack, and realized the crack wasn't in his security, or his money, or his soldiers. The crack was her. She was the only thing in the world he couldn't replace. She was the soft underbelly of the dragon. They had touched her not to take from her, but to speak to him. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. The muscles in his neck corded with tension. The car turned off the main avenue, winding its way up the hills toward the estate. The higher they went, the further they got from the grime of the streets. But the grime was inside the car now. It was in his head. It was coating his soul. When they arrived at the compound, the gates swung open before the car even slowed down. Guards with assault rifles stood at attention, their faces masks of grim discipline. They had heard the radio chatter. They knew the mood of the boss. They knew that tonight, blinking at the wrong time could cost a man his life. The atmosphere in the compound was suffocating, charged with a static electricity that promised violence. The car stopped at the front steps. Alejandro didn't wait for the driver. He opened his own door and stepped out into the continuing rain, then reached in to help Elena. She took his hand, her legs unsteady. He didn't pull her. He simply offered his strength, a solid anchor for her to grab onto. He scooped her up into his arms, carrying her bridal style up the stone steps. "I can walk," she protested weakly, though she buried her face in his shoulder, hiding from the eyes of the guards. "I know," he said. "But tonight, you don't have to." He carried her through the massive oak doors, past the marble foyer with its grand chandelier, past the portraits of his ancestors who had been farmers and soldiers, not kings. He carried her straight to the master bedroom, kicking the door shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the silent house. He set her down on the edge of the bed. The room was warm, lit only by the soft lamps on the nightstands. It was a sanctuary, a place where the violence of his work was never allowed to enter. It was a rule they had. No business in the bedroom, no guns on the nightstand, no talk of shipments or territories. But looking at her sitting there, wet and shivering, with blood on her chin, he realized that rule had been broken. The violence was here. It was sitting on his Egyptian cotton sheets. It had invaded the one place he thought was holy. He went to the bathroom and returned with a warm towel and a first aid kit. He knelt before her, ignoring the wet stain her clothes were leaving on the duvet. He was ruining a $5,000 suit kneeling on the floor, and he didn't care. He would have burned the whole house down just to warm her hands. He began to clean her up. He wiped the rain from her hair, drying the dark strands with slow, methodical strokes. He unbuttoned her soaked jacket, peeling the wet fabric away from her skin. She sat compliant, like a doll, her eyes tracking his movements, watching him for signs of the explosion she knew was coming. "Does it hurt?" he asked, applying antiseptic to the cut on her lip. Only when I try to smile, she managed a weak joke. It fell flat. The air was too heavy for humor. The silence that followed was loud. He stopped. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers, diving into the depths of her pupils. "Who did this, Elena?" She hesitated. She looked away towards the window where the rain was lashing against the glass. It was dark outside, a void. I didn't see his face clearly. He was wearing a hood. "But?" Alejandro pressed. He knew there was a but. He could hear it in the silence. But he said something. Alejandro went very still. His hands, which had been moving with such gentleness, froze in mid-air. What did he say? She swallowed hard. He said, "Tell the saint that even heaven has gates, and we just kick them open." The saint. El Santo. It was the nickname the streets had given him years ago. Not because he was holy, but because when he decided you were going to die, you usually prayed. It was a mocking title, one used by his enemies before they disappeared. It was a name from the old days, before he wore suits, when he wore blood. Alejandro slowly lowered the cotton swab. He placed it back in the kit. He closed the lid. The click of the plastic latch sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I see," he said. His voice was void of emotion. It was a flat, dead thing. He finished cleaning her up in silence. He helped her change into dry clothes, a soft, oversized t-shirt that belonged to him. It hung on her small frame, making her look even more fragile. He tucked her into bed, pulling the heavy comforter up to her chin. "Stay with me?" she asked, her hand reaching out to grab his wrist. Her fingers were warm now, but her eyes were still full of that terrible, haunted shadow. He looked at her hand on his wrist. He wanted nothing more than to climb into that bed, wrap his arms around her, and sleep for 100 years. He wanted to pretend that he was just a man, and she was just a woman, and the world outside didn't exist. He wanted to watch Netflix and drink wine and argue about what to order for dinner. But he wasn't just a man. He was a consequence. And there was a debt to be paid. "I will stay until you fall asleep," he promised. He sat on the edge of the bed, stroking her hair as her breathing deepened. He watched her fight the exhaustion, her eyelids fluttering, until finally, the trauma and the warmth of the bed won out. She drifted off, her hand slowly slipping from his wrist to the mattress. Alejandro sat there for a long time. He watched her sleep. He watched the rise and fall of her chest. He memorized the rhythm of her life, engraving it onto his soul so he would never forget what he was fighting for. Then he stood up. The transformation was instantaneous. The husband who had knelt on the floor with a warm towel vanished. In his place stood the myth. He walked to the walk-in closet and stripped off his wetsuit. He didn't put on pajamas. He put on a black tactical shirt. He put on dark pants. He strapped a shoulder holster over his chest, the leather familiar and comforting against his ribs. He checked the magazine of his sidearm, the metallic click of the slide racking back, serving as the opening note of the symphony he was about to conduct. He walked out of the bedroom, closing the door with the softness of a ghost. Downstairs, the atmosphere had changed. The silence of the house had been replaced by a buzzing, electric tension. His lieutenants were there. They stood in the living room, 6 men who controlled the 6 districts of the city. They were hard men, men who had killed and bled for him, men who feared nothing. But when Alejandro walked down the stairs, they looked at their shoes. They felt the shift in air pressure. They knew that the man descending the staircase wasn't the businessman who negotiated trade routes. This was the butcher who had carved those routes out of the jungle. This was the man who had survived the wars of the 90s. Alejandro didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and drank it in one swallow. He set the glass down. The crystal clinked against the wood. "Who was on duty in Sector 4?" he asked. He didn't turn around. He spoke to the bottles lined up on the shelf. A man stepped forward. "Diego?" He was a veteran, a man who had been with the cartel since the beginning. Boss, it was Marco's team. They said they lost eyes on her for 2 minutes. She turned a corner and 2 minutes. Alejandro repeated. He turned around slowly. Diego swallowed. Yes, patron. 2 minutes. Alejandro nodded. He walked over to Diego. He looked him in the eye. Diego didn't flinch, but his pupils were dilated. A bullet travels at 2,000 feet per second, Diego, Alejandro said softly. A knife takes half a second to cut a throat. A heart stops in an instant. Do you know how many eternities fit inside 2 minutes? Diego said nothing. There was nothing to say. Alejandro walked past him, toward the heavy oak doors that led out to the rainy night. Bring me Marco, he said, and bring me the men who were with him. They are in the basement, patron, another lieutenant said. Good. Alejandro didn't stop walking. Leave them there. I will deal with them later. Right now, we have a message to answer. He stopped at the door and looked back at the group of hardened criminals. She said the man mentioned the saint. He said they kicked open the gates of heaven. The room went deadly silent. Everyone knew who used that rhetoric. Everyone knew which rival faction had been pressing on the southern borders, using religious iconography, calling themselves the Crusaders. It was the Norte Valley Cartel. Alejandro opened the door. The wind howled outside, carrying the rain into the foyer. Get the cars, Alejandro ordered, and call the precinct. Tell the captain to pull every uniform off the streets in the South District. Tell him that if I see a single police car tonight, I will burn the station down with him inside it. But, patron, Diego stammered, the South District. That is Norte territory. If we go in there in force, it is war. Alejandro stepped out into the rain. He didn't look back. The thunder rolled overhead, a low growl that matched the vibration in his chest. It is not war, Diego, he said, his voice lost in the storm but heard by every man in the room. War implies there is a chance for them to win. This is not war. This is pest control. He walked down the steps to the waiting convoy. This time, no one held the door for him. He opened it himself. He climbed into the back seat, not of the luxury sedan, but of the armored SUV. He sat in the dark, the rain hammering against the bulletproof glass. He closed his eyes for a second and saw her face. He saw the bruise. He saw the fear. When he opened his eyes, the darkness in them was absolute. Drive, he said. The convoy moved out, a serpentine line of black metal, cutting through the storm. They weren't heading for a meeting. They weren't heading for a negotiation. They were heading to the South District. As they crossed the bridge that separated his territory from theirs, Alejandro reached for the radio handset. He keyed the mic that broadcasted to every car in his convoy. Listen to me, he said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly so. Tonight, there are no rules. Tonight, we do not negotiate. Tonight, we do not take prisoners. You look for the men who run the corners. You look for the men who collect the money. You look for anyone who answers to the Norte flag. He paused, watching the city lights flicker through the rain. You ask them one question. You ask them who gave the order to touch her. And when they tell you, you kill them anyway. The radio clicked off. The city of Bogota is old. It has seen conquerors and revolutions. It has seen fires and plagues. But as the clock struck midnight, the city seemed to hunch its shoulders against the coming onslaught. The streets emptied out. The homeless, sensing the change in the atmospheric pressure, retreated into the shadows. The stray dogs stopped barking. The predator was loose. Alejandro looked at his watch. 12:03 a.m. By dawn, he had promised himself, the man who touched her would be screaming. But before that, he was going to make sure that everyone who had ever shaken that man's hand would bleed. The SUV accelerated. The engine roared. And in the back seat, the man who owned the police, the man who was the law, touched the breast pocket of his tactical shirt. Inside, close to his heart, was the handkerchief stained with her blood. It was the only warrant he needed. The convoy tore through the wet streets, a river of black steel flowing against the current of the city. Inside the lead vehicle, Alejandro sat in silence, his mind a tactical map of the destruction he was about to unleash. He wasn't thinking about profit margins or territory expansion. Those were the concerns of a businessman. Tonight, he was thinking about anatomy. He was thinking about how much pressure it takes to break a finger. He was thinking about the specific sound a man makes when he realizes his God isn't listening. The phone in his pocket buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He knew who it was. It would be the politicians, the frantic intermediaries, the people who were paid to keep the peace. They would have heard the engine starting. They would have seen the movement on the traffic cameras. They would be calling to ask for restraint. He let it ring. Restraint was a luxury for men who hadn't seen their wife's blood on a rainy Tuesday. "We are approaching the perimeter," the driver said, his eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror. Alejandro looked out. The architecture was changing. The high-rises and glass towers of the north were giving way to the sprawling, chaotic density of the south. Here, the streets were narrower. The streetlights were broken. The shadows were deeper. This was Norte territory. It was a place where the police didn't go without backup, a place where the rules of the government ended and the rules of the street began. "Stop the car," Alejandro said. The driver hesitated. "Here, patron? In the open? Stop the car." The convoy ground to a halt in the middle of the intersection. The rain hammered on the roof. Alejandro opened his door and stepped out. His men scrambled to follow, their weapons raised, forming a protective ring around him. But Alejandro ignored them. He walked to the center of the street. He stood under a flickering yellow streetlight, a lone figure in black against the wet gray of the world. He looked up at the buildings surrounding them. He knew there were eyes in those windows. He knew there were lookouts on the roofs. He spread his arms wide. "I am here!" he roared. His voice carried over the sound of the rain, echoing off the concrete. "I am Alejandro Vargas, and I have come to collect." There was silence. Then, a shout from a rooftop, a muzzle flash. A bullet sparked off the pavement 3 feet to his left. Alejandro didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply smiled. It was a cold, mirthless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good," he whispered to himself. "They are home." He turned back to his men. "Burn it," he said. "Burn it all." The night exploded. The night exploded not with a bang, but with a tearing sound, the air ripping apart as automatic gunfire chewed through the silence. Tracers cut through the rain like angry hornets of red and gold, sizzling as they hit the wet asphalt. The world turned into a strobe light of violence. Alejandro walked back to the cover of the armored SUV, not running, not ducking, but moving with the fluid, inevitable grace of a tidal wave. Bullets sparked against the pavement near his boots, but he didn't flinch. He had lived his entire life in the crosshairs. Tonight was no different, except for the fury that burned cold in his chest, a glacial fire that consumed fear, and left only purpose. His men were already returning fire. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of heavy caliber rifles drowning out the thunder. They were professionals, trained in the jungles and hardened on the streets, moving in precise tactical formations. They advanced on the building from which the shot had come, a crumbling tenement block that smelled of mold and desperation. Alejandro watched them go, his eyes scanning the dark windows, the rooftops, the shadows. He wasn't looking for the shooter. The shooter was a pawn, a nothing. He was looking for the kings. "Give me the phone," Alejandro said, extending his hand without looking back. Diego, crouching behind the engine block of the SUV, handed him a satellite phone. Alejandro dialed a number he had memorized a decade ago, a number that belonged to a ghost. It rang twice. "Speak," a voice answered. It was raspy, old, the voice of a man who had smoked too many cigarettes and seen too many bodies. "Don Eladio," Alejandro said. His voice was smooth, polite even. "It is, Alejandro." There was a pause on the line, then a sigh. "I heard you were in the south, Alejandro. My people tell me the sky is falling." "Your people are observant," Alejandro replied. "I am calling out of respect, Eladio. You and I, we have had peace for 5 years. We have shared the river. We have shared the roots." "We have," Eladio agreed. "Why are you breaking it?" "I am not breaking it," Alejandro said, watching as a grenade exploded in the lobby of the tenement building, blowing the doors off their hinges in a shower of wood and glass. "I am correcting an error. Your nephew, the one they call the bishop." Silence. A heavy, pregnant silence. "What about him?" Eladio asked, his voice dropping an octave. "He touched what is mine," Alejandro said. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He stated it as a fact of physics, like gravity. "He sent men to my home. He sent men to my wife." The silence on the other end stretched out. Alejandro could hear the old man breathing. He could hear the gears turning, the calculations being made. Eladio was a businessman. He knew the cost of war, but he also knew the cost of pride. "He is young," Eladio said finally. "He is ambitious. He made a mistake." "A mistake is spilling wine on a rug, Eladio. Breaking the face of my wife is not a mistake. It is a resignation letter from life. Alejandro, listen to me." "No, you listen." Alejandro's voice dropped, becoming something guttural, something inhuman. "I am not asking for permission. I am giving you a courtesy. Stay in your hacienda tonight, Eladio. Keep your head down. Tell your personal guard to stand down, because I am going to tear the South District apart brick by brick until I find him. And if you stand in my way, if I see even one of your personal trucks on the road, I will forget the 5 years of peace. I will forget the river. I will come for you, and I will hang you from the gates of your own palace." The line went dead. Alejandro didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. He dropped the phone into a puddle and crushed it under the heel of his boot. He drew his weapon, a custom-made 1911, with grips made of ivory, cold and heavy in his hand. He moved forward. The street battle was a chaotic symphony. His men had breached the tenement and were clearing it, room by room. Gunshots echoed from inside the structure, muffled thumps that sounded like a giant heart beating erratically. Alejandro walked into the lobby. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of cordite. A body lay by the stairs, a young man in a hoodie, a cheap pistol lying just out of reach of his dead hand. Alejandro stepped over him without a glance. He climbed the stairs. He didn't rush. He walked with the weight of a judge ascending the bench. On the second floor, he found Diego holding a man by the throat against a peeling wall. The man was bleeding from the nose, his eyes wide with terror. He says he doesn't know where the bishop is. Diego spat, pressing the barrel of his rifle into the man's cheek. Alejandro holstered his gun. He walked over to the man. He looked at him. He saw the fear, yes, but he also saw the defiance. This was a soldier, a true believer. He doesn't know, Alejandro said softly. Diego looked surprised. Boss? He doesn't know because the bishop doesn't tell the pawns where he sleeps. Alejandro reached out and straightened the man's collar, brushing a speck of dust from his shoulder. But he knows where the money is. Don't you? The man clenched his jaw. I ain't telling you nothing, Saint. You can go to hell. Alejandro smiled. It was a sad smile. I am already there, son. I built the place. He nodded to Diego. Diego stepped back. Alejandro moved in close, his face inches from the man's. I am not going to hurt you, Alejandro lied. The lie was smooth, comforting. I just want you to deliver a message. Can you do that? The man blinked, confused by the sudden change in tone. What message? Tell the bishop that I am burning the cash houses. Tell him I am burning the product. Tell him that every dollar he has in this city is turning to ash tonight. Tell him that the only way to stop the fire is to come out and face me. Alejandro stepped back. Let him go. Diego hesitated. Boss, he's a shooter. He'll... Let him go. Alejandro repeated. Diego released the man. The soldier stumbled back, gasping for air, looking from Diego to Alejandro in disbelief. He scrambled toward the stairs, tripping over his own feet, running into the night to deliver the doom of his own organization. Alejandro walked to the window. He looked out at the rain-soaked street. He could see the lights of the city reflecting in the puddles, a kaleidoscope of despair. Why? Diego asked quietly. Why warn him? Because, Alejandro said, watching the man run down the alleyway below. A rat will hide in the walls if you hunt him, but if you burn the house down, the rat has to run, and when he runs, we will be waiting. Burn the block, Diego. Start with the warehouse on 5th, then the stash house on 9th. Leave nothing but smoke. As the orders went out, Alejandro allowed himself a moment of weakness. He closed his eyes and the image of Elena flooded his mind. Not the Elena with the bruised face, but the Elena from this morning. She had been laughing, drinking coffee in the sunroom, complaining about the neighbor's dog. She had looked so light, so untouched by the darkness of his world. He remembered the way the sunlight had caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. He remembered the softness of her skin. A wave of sadness crashed over him, so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He had promised to protect her. It was the only vow that mattered. He had sworn before God and before the devil that no harm would come to her. And he had failed. The violence he was unleashing now, the fire and the blood, it wasn't justice. It was penance. He was punishing the world because he couldn't punish himself enough. Boss? Alejandro opened his eyes. The moment was gone. The mask was back in place. The warehouse is secure, Diego said. We found the gasoline. Light it up. The night turned orange. The fire started in the east, a dull glow that rapidly grew into a roaring inferno. The warehouse, filled with millions of dollars of narcotics and cash, became a funeral pyre for the Norte cartel's ambitions. The flames licked at the rain, defying the water, reaching up into the black sky like grasping fingers. The heat was intense, pushing back the chill of the storm. Alejandro stood on a rooftop 2 blocks away, watching the destruction. The firelight danced in his eyes, making them look like pools of molten obsidian. He could hear the sirens now, wailing in the distance, but they weren't coming here. The police knew better. The fire department knew better. When the saint was working, the city turned a blind eye. His phone buzzed. A text message. Unknown number, sanctuary. 20 minutes. Come alone. Alejandro stared at the screen. Sanctuary. It was an old club, a neutral ground in the demilitarized zone of the city, a place where the old bosses used to meet to divide the spoils. It had been closed for years. He showed the phone to Diego. It's a trap, Diego said immediately. Obviously. Yes, Alejandro said. It is. He put the phone away. Get the car. Boss, you can't go alone. It's suicide. Alejandro looked at Diego. The firelight illuminated the scars on his lieutenant's face, maps of old wars. I am not going alone, Diego. I am taking my grief with me. And she is a very jealous companion. He walked away from the edge of the roof, leaving the burning city behind him. The drive to Sanctuary was a journey through a graveyard. The streets were deserted. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, a fine mist that coated the windshield in a shimmering film. Alejandro drove himself this time. He needed the control. He needed the mechanical connection of the machine, the vibration of the engine, the resistance of the steering wheel. He parked the SUV a block away from the club. The building was a hulking shadow, a relic of a bygone era of glamour that had long since rotted away. The neon sign flickered, the S and the T burnt out, leaving only Anquary. He checked his weapon, 1 in the chamber, 7 in the magazine, 2 spare magazines on his belt. He touched the handkerchief in his pocket again, his talisman, his reminder. He walked to the front door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped into the darkness. The air inside smelled of stale beer, old smoke, and mildew. The main room was a cavernous space, tables overturned, chairs stacked in corners. At the far end, a single spotlight illuminated a round table. Sitting at the table was a man. He was young, handsome in a cruel, sharp way, wearing a white suit that looked luminous in the darkness. He was sipping a glass of wine. The bishop. Alejandro walked toward him. His footsteps echoed on the wooden floorboards. Click, click, click. The sound of the clock ticking down. The bishop looked up. He smiled. You look tired, Alejandro. Alejandro stopped 10 feet from the table. He didn't draw his gun. He just stood there, hands at his sides, a statue of judgment. You look alive, Alejandro said. That is a temporary condition. The bishop laughed. He put down his glass. You burned my warehouse. You cost me $10 million tonight. I burned your coffin, Alejandro corrected. You just haven't climbed inside it yet. Why are you so angry, Saint? The bishop leaned back, crossing his legs. Because of the girl? She is... what? A civilian? A distraction? Alejandro didn't move, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She is my wife. Wives are replaceable, the bishop said, waving a hand dismissively. Power is not. You have been getting soft, Alejandro. You play at being a businessman. You wear the suits. You go to the galas. You forgot what we are. We are wolves. And wolves do not marry sheep. I did you a favor. I reminded you of who you are. You didn't remind me of who I am, Alejandro said, his voice barely a whisper. You reminded me of what I am capable of. The bishop snapped his fingers. From the shadows of the balcony above, a dozen men emerged. Red laser sights danced across Alejandro's chest, a swarm of angry fireflies. I knew you would come, the bishop said, standing up. You are predictable. Honor, love, revenge, these are buttons, and I push them. Now you die here, and tomorrow I take the north. Alejandro looked up at the men on the balcony. He looked at the lasers painting his heart. He didn't look afraid. He looked bored. You think this is a trap? Alejandro asked. The bishop spread his arms. It looks like a trap. It smells like a trap. I'd say it is a remarkably successful trap. Alejandro reached into his pocket. The men on the balcony tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. But he didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a remote detonator, a small black plastic box with a single red button. The bishop's smile faltered. What is that? You are right, Alejandro said, running his thumb over the button. Wolves do not marry sheep. But you forgot one thing about me, Bishop. I am not a wolf. He looked the bishop in the eye. I am the flood. Alejandro pressed the button. The explosion didn't come from the building. It came from the sewers beneath it. Alejandro had rigged the city blocks ago. He hadn't come alone. He had come with C4. The floor beneath the bishop's men on the balcony erupted upwards, a shaped charge designed to shear the supports. The balcony collapsed with a deafening roar, bringing tons of concrete and steel down on top of the gunmen. Dust billowed out, a choking gray cloud that swallowed the light. In the chaos, Alejandro moved. He didn't run for cover. He ran forward. He dove through the dust cloud, the 1911 in his hand barking fire. Bam! 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 3 shots, 3 bodies falling from the debris. He was a wraith in the smoke, moving by instinct and sound. The bishop was screaming, scrambling back, trying to pull a gold-plated desert eagle from his waistband. He was fast, but he was panicked. Alejandro was calm. Alejandro tackled him, slamming him into the remains of the table. The wine glass shattered, spraying red liquid that looked too much like blood. The gun skittered across the floor. Alejandro was on top of him instantly, his hand clamped around the bishop's throat. He didn't squeeze to kill. He squeezed to silence. "Look at me!" Alejandro roared, the first time he had raised his voice all night. The sound was terrifying, a lion's roar in a confined space. "Look at me!" The bishop clawed at Alejandro's arm, his eyes bulging, his face turning purple. He looked up into the eyes of the saint and saw no mercy, no humanity. He saw only the void. "You touched her!" Alejandro hissed, leaning in close, his spit landing on the bishop's face. "You put your hands on her. It wasn't me!" The bishop gasped, struggling for air. "Who?" Alejandro loosened his grip just enough to let the man speak. "Who gave the order?" "You're too stupid to plan this. You are a child playing with matches. Who told you to strike?" The bishop coughed, gasping for breath, tears streaming down his face. He was broken. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the sudden, violent reality of his own mortality. It was the council, he whimpered. Alejandro froze. The council. The shadowy collective of the old guard, the men who sat in the high towers of Panama and Mexico, the men who supposedly had retired. They were the ones who regulated the trade. They were the ones who enforced the truces. "Why?" Alejandro demanded. "Because," the bishop sobbed, "because you were getting too big. You were uniting the city. They don't want peace, Saint. They want war. War is profitable. They wanted you to break. They wanted you to destroy yourself." Alejandro stared at him. It wasn't a rival gang. It wasn't a turf war. It was the system itself. The machine he had served his whole life had turned on him because he had dared to try and build something stable. He had dared to be happy. He slowly stood up, dragging the bishop with him. He slammed the man against the only standing wall. "You are going to take me to them," Alejandro said. "I can't," the bishop stammered. "They are ghosts. No one knows where they are." "You know," Alejandro said, pressing the barrel of his gun against the bishop's forehead. "You took their order. You know how to reach them." The bishop was shaking uncontrollably. "If I tell you, they will kill me." Alejandro leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than the grave. "Look around you, Bishop. Look at the fire. Look at the bodies. You are worried about them killing you?" He cocked the hammer of the gun. "I am the one holding the gun. I am the one who is here. And I am telling you, death is the easy way out. If you don't talk, I will keep you alive. I will keep you alive for a very, very long time. And every day I will ask you again." The bishop looked into Alejandro's eyes and saw the truth. He saw the infinite capacity for cruelty that lay behind the mask of the civilized man. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I'll tell you." Alejandro lowered the gun. "Good." He grabbed the bishop by the collar and dragged him toward the exit. The dust was settling. The sirens were getting closer. The police were finally coming, brave now that the shooting had stopped. Alejandro walked out into the night, dragging his prisoner. The rain had stopped. The air was cold and clean. He pulled his phone out. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. He dialed Elena. It rang once, then her voice, sleepy and scared. "Alejandro? I am here, mi amor," he said. His voice softened instantly, the monster receding, the husband returning. "Are you okay? Is it over?" "No," he said, looking at the shivering man at his feet. "It is not over. It has just begun. But I'm coming home soon." He hung up. He looked at the bishop. "Get in the trunk." The bishop hesitated. Alejandro didn't speak. He just pointed. The bishop climbed into the trunk of the SUV, curling into a ball. Alejandro slammed the lid shut. He got into the driver's seat. He looked at his hands. They were steady now. The shaking had stopped. The guilt was still there, a heavy stone in his gut. But the helplessness was gone. He had a name. He had a target. He had a path. The council wanted war. They wanted chaos. They wanted the monster. Alejandro started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness. "So be it," he whispered to the empty car. They wanted the monster. They were going to get the devil himself. The SUV moved through the night like a hearse carrying the devil himself. The city of Bogotá was behind them now, a sprawling galaxy of yellow lights fading in the rearview mirror. Ahead lay the mountains, dark, jagged teeth biting into the underbelly of the storm clouds. The rain had not stopped. It had evolved. It was no longer a drizzle but a deluge, a vertical ocean trying to drown the world in penance. Alejandro drove with one hand on the wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the winding road that snaked up into the darkness. In the trunk, the bishop was thumping against the lid, a muffled, rhythmic drumming that sounded like a second heartbeat, frantic and terrified. Diego sat in the passenger seat, reloading his magazines. The metallic click-clack of the cartridges sliding home was the only conversation they needed. Diego had been with Alejandro since they were boys stealing hubcaps in the slums of Medellin. He knew the silence of the boss. He knew that when Alejandro went this quiet, he wasn't thinking about strategy. He was thinking about execution. "Where are we going, patron?" Diego asked finally, his voice low. barely cutting through the hum of the engine and the roar of the wind. Las nubes, Alejandro said. The clouds. Diego stopped loading his weapon. He looked at Alejandro, his eyes wide in the dashboard lights. The mountain estate? Patron, that is a fortress. If the council is meeting there, then they are meeting in their grave. Alejandro finished. He pressed his foot down on the accelerator. The heavy armored vehicle surged forward, the engine growling a challenge to the steep incline. Las Nubes was a myth in the underworld. It was a compound built on a cliff edge, accessible only by a single private road. It was where the old bosses went to die in luxury. It was where treaties were signed in blood and champagne. And tonight, it was where Alejandro was going to end the era of the old guard. He thought of Elena. The image of her face, bruised and broken, was burned onto his retinas. It overlaid everything he saw. He looked at the road, and he saw her split lip. He looked at the trees flashing by in the headlights, and he saw the fear in her eyes. The rage in his chest was a physical thing, a parasite eating his organs one by one. He welcomed the pain. It kept him sharp. It kept him cruel. The phone in the center console buzzed. It was the same unknown number. Alejandro ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. Answer it, Alejandro said. Diego picked up the phone. He put it on speaker. Alejandro, a voice said. It was smooth, cultured, the voice of a grandfather reading a bedtime story. It was Don Eladio again. But this time, the old man didn't sound patronizing. He sounded weary. I told you to stay in your hacienda, Eladio, Alejandro said, his eyes never leaving the wet asphalt. I am there, Alejandro. I am watching the news. I see the smoke rising from the south. You have made your point. I haven't even started making my point. Alejandro replied, Listen to me, son. The voice on the phone hardened slightly. You are driving up the mountain. My scouts see you. You are going to Las Nubes. Yes. You cannot win this, Alejandro. There are 50 men up there. They have heavy weapons. They have the high ground. You are one car. 2 men. I have the bishop in the trunk, Alejandro said. Eladio paused. Is he alive? For now. Alejandro, turn the car around. Go home to your wife. We can negotiate. The council is willing to offer. Alejandro laughed. It was a dry, barking sound that lacked any humor. Negotiate? You think I want money? You think I want territory? You broke the one law that matters, Eladio. You touched the family. We didn't know. Eladio pleaded. The bishop? He acted alone. The council didn't order the hit on your wife. We ordered pressure. We told him to squeeze your supply lines. He is a psychopath. He took it too far. It doesn't matter, Alejandro said softly. You gave the dog the leash. You are responsible for where he bites. I can give you the men who did it. Eladio offered. I can give you their heads on a platter. Just turn around. Do not go to Las Nubes. If you go there, there is no coming back. You declare war on the entire cartel system. You will be hunted in every country. You will never sleep again. Alejandro looked at the rain smashing against the windshield. He thought about the years he had spent building his empire, the bribes, the handshakes, the uneasy peace. He had done it all to build a wall around Elena, a fortress of money and influence to keep her safe. And tonight, he realized that the wall was made of paper. I am already at war, Eladio, Alejandro said. And as for sleeping, I don't plan on sleeping. I plan on waking up. He hung up the phone. Throw it out the window, he ordered. Diego rolled down the window and tossed the phone into the abyss of the ravine. The wind howled into the cabin for a second, carrying the scent of pine and ozone before the glass slid back up. "They know we are coming," Diego said. "Good," Alejandro said. "Surprise is for amateurs. I want them to see me coming. I want them to have time to be afraid." The road leveled out. They were nearing the summit. The air was thinner here, colder. Ahead, the massive iron gates of Las Nubes loomed out of the mist, illuminated by floodlights. 2 guard towers flanked the entrance. There were men in the towers. Alejandro could see the silhouettes of rifles. Diego checked his weapon again. "Patron? The plan?" Alejandro reached under his seat and pulled out a modified flashbang grenade. He handed it to Diego. Then he pulled out a second item. It was a detonator. Not for the C4 in the city, that was gone. This was for the car. "The SUV was rigged?" Diego asked, his eyebrows shooting up. "Always," Alejandro said. "When we hit the gate," Alejandro said, his voice calm and precise, "I am going to ram the center post. The airbag will deploy, cut it, bail out the passenger side, roll to the ditch. And you? I will be right behind you. And the car? The car is the distraction." Alejandro floored the accelerator. The engine roared, a mechanical beast screaming in defiance. The SUV shot forward, eating up the distance to the gates. In the towers, the guards shouted. Searchlights swung toward them, blinding white beams that turned the raindrops into diamonds. Gunfire erupted. Bullets pinged off the armored hood, spider-webbing the bulletproof glass. Alejandro didn't blink. He held the wheel steady, aiming for the seam between the 2 massive iron doors. "Hold on!" he yelled. The impact was cataclysmic. The heavy SUV slammed into the gates at 80 miles per hour. Metal screamed. The iron buckled. The lock shattered. The car punched through, spinning out of control into the cobblestone courtyard of the estate. The airbags exploded in a cloud of white powder. Alejandro was moving before the dust settled. He slashed the bag with a knife he kept on his belt, kicked the door open, and rolled out onto the wet stones. Gunfire chewed up the ground where he had been a second before. He scrambled to the cover of a stone fountain. Diego was already there, firing short, controlled bursts at the towers. "Cover me!" Alejandro shouted. He pulled the detonator from his pocket. He looked at the SUV. It was sitting in the middle of the courtyard, steam rising from the crushed radiator. The trunk had popped open from the impact. The bishop was screaming inside, trapped in the wreckage. Alejandro felt a twinge of pity. It was a small, weak thing, and he crushed it instantly. He pressed the button. The SUV dissolved in a ball of fire. The explosion was deafening. It shook the ground and shattered the windows of the main mansion. The shockwave knocked the guards in the towers off their feet. The flaming wreckage of the car was thrown into the air, raining down burning metal and gasoline. The bishop was gone, vaporized. A message delivered in fire. "Move!" Alejandro commanded. He and Diego sprinted across the courtyard while the guards were still recovering from the blast. They reached the heavy wooden doors of the main house. Alejandro didn't bother knocking. He shot the lock out with his 1911 and kicked the door in. They were inside. The foyer of Las Nubes was a masterpiece of colonial architecture. High ceilings, velvet drapes, marble floors. And now, it was a battlefield. Guards were pouring down the grand staircase, firing wildly. Alejandro and Diego took cover behind a massive oak table, flipping it over. Wood splinters filled the air like confetti. Alejandro fired back. He was a surgeon with the pistol. Bang! A guard on the landing fell. Bang! Another one tumbled down the stairs. He wasn't firing to suppress. He was firing to kill. Every shot was a decision. Every bullet was a verdict. Diego was changing magazines. "There are too many of them!" he yelled over the noise. Alejandro looked around. He saw a chandelier hanging above the staircase, suspended by a thick rope that was tied off at a cleat on the wall near them. "The rope?" Alejandro pointed. Diego understood immediately. He raised his rifle and fired at the rope. The heavy crystal chandelier, weighing nearly a ton, plummeted. It crashed onto the staircase, crushing two guards and sending a shower of glass shrapnel exploding outward. The remaining guards scrambled back, terrified by the sudden destruction. "Up!" Alejandro yelled. They charged up the stairs, their boots crunching on the broken crystal. They moved like shadows, clearing the landing, moving down the hallway. The council would be in the library. It was the only room large enough, the only room soundproofed. Alejandro knew the layout of this house. He had been a guest here once, years ago, when he was just a rising star, and they were the gods. They reached the double doors at the end of the hall. Alejandro reloaded his pistol. He looked at Diego. Diego was bleeding from a graze on his arm, but his eyes were focused. "Ready?" Alejandro asked. "For you, patron?" "Always." Alejandro kicked the doors open. The room was silent. It was a vast library, lined with books that no one read, smelling of old paper and expensive cigars. In the center of the room sat a long mahogany table. Sitting around it were 5 men. They were old. Their skin was like parchment, their hands liver-spotted. They wore suits that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like bankers. They looked like politicians. Standing behind them were their personal bodyguards, weapons drawn. Alejandro walked into the room. He didn't raise his gun. He let it hang by his side. He walked until he was at the head of the table. The bodyguards tensed, fingers on triggers. "Don't," one of the old men said. It was Eladio. He was sitting at the far end. "Put the guns down. If he wanted to kill us, he would have thrown a grenade through the door." The bodyguards hesitated, then lowered their weapons slightly. Alejandro looked at the men. He knew them all. Don Eladio, the patriarch, Don Chepe, the smuggler, Don Fausto, the politician, Don Pacho, the banker, Don Gilberto, the ghost. These were the architects of the drug trade, the men who decided the price of a kilo of cocaine in New York and the price of a human life in Bogota. "You are late, Alejandro," Don Fausto said, taking a sip of brandy. His hand was shaking slightly. "Traffic was bad," Alejandro said. "I had to remove a roadblock." "The bishop?" Eladio asked. "Ashes," Alejandro said. A silence settled over the room. The old men exchanged glances. They were not used to this. They were used to respect. They were used to fear. But looking at the man standing before them, soaked in rain and blood, his eyes burning with a cold, dead light, they realized that their currency had no value here. "Why are you here, Alejandro?" Don Gilberto asked. "You have your revenge. The boy is dead. The warehouse is burned. You have made your point. Go home." Alejandro placed his gun on the table. The heavy metal clunked against the wood. "I am not here for revenge," he said softly. "Revenge is for what you lost. I am here for what I still have." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bloody handkerchief. He dropped it onto the center of the table. The white cloth, stained with the red blood of his wife, looked shockingly bright against the dark wood. "This is my wife's blood," Alejandro said. The men looked at it. Some looked away. "You broke the contract. Alejandro said. The unwritten rule: we kill each other. We kill soldiers. We kill snitches. But we do not touch the families. We do not bring the war into the kitchen. It was an accident, Don Chepe muttered. A rogue element. There are no rogue elements. Alejandro roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The sudden violence made the old man jump. You built this machine. You grease the gears. When the machine eats a leg, you don't blame the gears. You blame the operator. He leaned over the table, his eyes scanning their faces. You think because you sit in this room, drinking your 100-year-old cognac, that you are clean. You think because you don't pull the trigger, your hands aren't bloody? He pointed at the handkerchief. That blood is on you. And now I have a problem. What problem? Eladia asked cautiously. The problem, Alejandro said, straightening up, is that my wife is afraid. She's afraid in her own home, and I cannot have that. So what do you want? Don Pacho asked. Money? Territory? Alejandro smiled. It was the most terrifying expression they had ever seen. It was a smile of absolute, unyielding resolution. I want you to retire, Alejandro said. The room went still. Excuse me? Don Fausto laughed nervously. I want you to retire, Alejandro repeated. All of you. Tonight. You sign over your territories. You sign over your roots. You step down. You go to your villas in France or your islands in the Caribbean, and you never, ever come back to Colombia. You are insane. Don Chepe spat. We are the council. We are the trade. You cannot just ask us to leave. I am not asking, Alejandro said. He looked at Diego. Diego nodded and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen. Suddenly, the large television screen on the wall of the library flickered to life. It showed a live feed. It was a bedroom. A child's bedroom. There were posters of superheroes on the wall. A small boy was sleeping in the bed. Don Chepe went pale. That is my grandson. Alejandro nodded. Diego tapped the screen again. Another feed. A woman sitting in a living room reading a book. Don Fausto gasped. My daughter. Another feed. An elderly woman praying in a chapel. Don Eladio closed his eyes. Maria? Alejandro looked at the men. I told you, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I am not a wolf. I am the flood. A flood goes everywhere. It seeps under the doors. It fills the cracks. You wouldn't, Eladia whispered. You are a man of honor, Alejandro. You said we do not touch the families. Alejandro picked up the bloody handkerchief. I said you do not touch the families, but you changed the rules. And when the rules change, I adapt. He looked at them, his eyes hard as diamonds. My men are outside their houses right now. They are waiting for my call. If I walk out of this room with your resignations, they walk away. If I don't, he let the sentence hang in the air, heavy with the promise of violence. You are a monster, Don Gilberto whispered. Yes, Alejandro agreed. I am. And that is why you are going to give me the city, because a monster can protect it. A committee of old men cannot. There was a long, agonizing silence. The rain lashed against the windows, a drum roll for the execution of an era. One by one, the old men looked at the screen. They looked at the people they loved, the people they had tried to keep separate from their sins. They realized, with a crushing clarity, that Alejandro was right. They had built a world of violence, and now the violence had come home. Eladio was the first to move. He reached into his jacket. The bodyguards tensed, but he only pulled out a pen. He took a piece of paper from the table. He wrote something on it. He signed it. He pushed it toward Alejandro. It is done, Eladio said. his voice old and broken. Take it. Take the city. Just let her finish her prayers. Alejandro took the paper. He didn't look at it. He looked at the others. One by one, they followed suit. The surrender was absolute. In 5 minutes, the power structure of the Colombian underworld, a structure that had stood for 30 years, was dismantled by one man with a broken heart and a live video feed. Alejandro gathered the papers. He signaled to Diego. Diego cut the feed. "Thank you, gentlemen," Alejandro said. He turned to leave. "Alejandro!" Eladio called out. Alejandro stopped at the door. "Do you think this brings you peace?" Eladio asked. "Do you think that by becoming the king, you can keep her safe?" Alejandro looked back. "I don't need peace, Eladio. Peace is for the dead." He walked out of the room. As they walked down the hallway, stepping over the bodies of the guards, Diego looked at Alejandro. "Patron," he whispered. "The feeds, the men outside their houses, were they real?" Alejandro didn't stop walking. "No," he said. Diego stopped. He stared at Alejandro's back. But you showed them." "I showed them recordings from last week," Alejandro said. "I bought the security footage from their own surveillance companies. There is no one outside their houses, Diego. I would never touch a child. I would never touch a grandmother." Diego hurried to catch up, his mind reeling. You bluffed the council? You bluffed the most dangerous men in the world?" Alejandro pushed open the front doors, stepping back out into the storm. The rain washed the blood from his hands, but it couldn't wash it from his soul. "I didn't bluff, Diego," Alejandro said, looking up at the dark sky. "I let them see their own fear. They looked at me, and they saw a monster, so they believed I would do a monstrous thing. They defeated themselves." He walked to the edge of the courtyard, looking out over the valley. The lights of Bogota twinkled below. A sea of stars. It was his city now. All of it. Every street corner, every port, every peso, he was the king. But as he stood there, the adrenaline began to fade, and the cold seeped back in. He touched the pocket where the handkerchief lay. "Let's go home," he said. They found a car in the garage. A pristine Rolls-Royce. Alejandro drove. The descent from the mountain was quiet. The battle was over. The war was won. But Alejandro felt a strange unease, a prickly sensation on the back of his neck. It was too easy. The surrender had been too quick. He pulled his phone out. He dialed home. It rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. He dialed the head of his house guard. No answer. Alejandro's heart, which had been beating steady and slow during the gunfight, suddenly hammered against his ribs. "Drive faster," he said to himself, pressing the pedal to the floor. Something was wrong. The feeling grew with every mile. By the time they reached the city limits, Alejandro was driving like a madman, weaving through traffic, running red lights. He dialed Elena's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. "Hi, this is Elena. Leave a message." "Elena, pick up," he said, his voice tight. "Pick up the phone." Silence. They reached the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, too quiet. They turned the corner onto his street. Alejandro slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt on the wet pavement. The gates to his compound were open, not forced open, not rammed open, just open. And the lights were out. The entire house was dark, a black void in the middle of the wealthy suburb. "No," Alejandro whispered. He jumped out of the car while it was still rolling. He ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life. He ran past the guard booth. Empty. No bodies. Just empty. He ran up the driveway. The front door was ajar. "Elena!" He screamed. The name tore out of his throat. Raw and desperate, he burst into the foyer. It was pitch black. He pulled his gun, the tactical light cutting a beam through the darkness. Elena. Silence. He ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time. He burst into the bedroom. Empty. The bed was made. The first aid kit was still on the nightstand where he had left it. But she was gone. He spun around, checking the bathroom, the closet. Nothing. He ran back out into the hallway. Diego was downstairs, clearing the rooms. "Kitchen clear!" Diego shouted. "Living room clear! Patron, there is no one here! There is no struggle!" Alejandro stood in the hallway, his chest heaving. No struggle. That was worse. That meant they had taken her without a fight. Or he saw something. On the wall at the end of the hallway, pinned to the family portrait with a knife. A note. Alejandro walked toward it. His legs felt heavy, like he was walking through water. He pulled the knife out. The paper fluttered into his hand. He shined his light on it. It wasn't a ransom note. It wasn't a threat from the council. It was a single sentence, written in elegant, cursive script. "You looked for the wolves, Alejandro, but you forgot about the shepherd." Alejandro stared at the note. The shepherd. A memory surfaced. A name from the very beginning, from before the cartels, from the days of the paramilitary death squads. The shepherd was a myth, a ghost story told to scare young sicarios. The man who controlled the shadows, the man who had trained Eladio, the man everyone thought had died 20 years ago. His phone rang. It wasn't the unknown number. It was Elena's phone. Alejandro answered it instantly. "Elena." "Hello, Alejandro." The voice was not Elena's. It was not Eladio's. It was a voice he had never heard before, a voice that sounded like grinding stones. "Where is she?" Alejandro whispered. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, absolute terror. "She is safe," the voice said. "For now. You have been a very busy boy tonight, Alejandro. You burned the warehouse. You dismantled the council. You took the city. I am impressed. Who are you?" "I am the one who opened the gate," the voice said. "You see, Alejandro, you made a mistake. You thought the council was the disease, but they were just the symptoms. I am the virus. What do you want? I want you to come to me," the voice said. "Alone. No Diego, no guns. Just you." "Where?" "The cathedral," the voice said. "The old one, in the jungle. You know the place. It is where you killed your first man." Alejandro's blood ran cold. The cathedral, the abandoned prison in the rainforest where Pablo had built his own cage. It was a place of ghosts. "If I come, you let her go?" The voice laughed softly. "If you come, Alejandro, we will see if you are truly the saint you claim to be. You have 1 hour. If you are late, I will send her to you in pieces." The line went dead. Alejandro stood in the dark hallway. He lowered the phone. Diego came running up the stairs. "Patron? Who was it?" Alejandro didn't answer. He walked into the bedroom. He opened a hidden safe in the floor of the closet. He didn't take money. He didn't take passports. He took a rosary. A simple, wooden rosary that had belonged to his mother. He put it around his neck. Then he took a knife. A long, serrated combat knife. He sheathed it at his belt. "Patron?" Diego asked, standing in the doorway. "Where are we going?" Alejandro turned. His face was a mask of stone. There was no humanity left in it. The husband was gone. The businessman was gone. Even the king was gone. There was only the executioner. "I am going to hell, Diego," Alejandro said. "Stay here." "No." Diego said, stepping forward. I go where you go. Not this time, brother. This is not a fight for soldiers. This is a fight for souls. Alejandro walked past him, down the stairs, and out into the night. The rain was still falling, harder now. A biblical storm to wash away the sins of the world. He got into the Rolls-Royce. He started the engine. 1 hour. The cathedral was 50 miles away, deep in the jungle. Alejandro drove. He didn't feel fear anymore. He didn't feel guilt. He felt a strange, terrible clarity. The shepherd wanted the saint. He was going to get him. But he was going to bring the devil with him. The Rolls-Royce Phantom is a masterpiece of British engineering. It is designed to float over the potholes of London and glide through the avenues of Dubai. It is not designed for the dirt tracks of the Colombian rainforest. But Alejandro drove it like a tank. The mud churned under the tires, splattering the pristine white paint with the filth of the jungle. Branches whipped against the windows, scratching the glass, trying to claw their way inside. The car was a foreign object here, an intruder from a world of order invading a world of chaos. The deeper he drove, the heavier the hot air became. The rain here wasn't just falling, it was living. It pulsed with the sound of the jungle, the screech of insects, the croak of frogs, the rustle of unseen things moving in the undergrowth. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the suffocating green darkness. Alejandro wasn't looking at the road. He was driving by memory, guided by the ghosts of his past. 50 miles, 40 miles, 10 miles. The cathedral. It wasn't a church. It was a prison, built by a drug lord for himself. A golden cage that had long since turned to rust. After Pablo died, the jungle had reclaimed it. The government had tried to destroy it. But concrete is stubborn, and legends are harder to kill than men. Now, it was just a scar on the mountain, a place where teenagers went to drink and where enemies of the state went to disappear. Alejandro stopped the car at the bottom of the hill. The road had washed away. He would have to walk the last mile. He turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and crushing. He stepped out into the mud. The humidity hit him like a physical blow, thick and cloying, smelling of rot and blooming flowers. He took off his jacket. He took off his tie. He rolled up the sleeves of his shirt. He wasn't the kingpin anymore. He wasn't the businessman. He was the boy who had walked out of this jungle 20 years ago with blood on his hands and a dream in his heart. He touched the rosary around his neck. He touched the knife at his belt. I am coming, he whispered. He began to climb. The path was steep, slick with oil and rain. Alejandro climbed with a steady, rhythmic pace. His breath hissed in his lungs. His heart hammered a war drum against his ribs. Every step was a prayer. Let her be alive. Let her be safe. Take me instead. He reached the perimeter fence. The chain link was rusted, torn open like a ribcage. He stepped through the gap. Ahead, the main structure of the cathedral loomed out of the mist. It was a hulking concrete monolith, covered in vines that looked like veins. The windows were black eyes staring down at him. There were no guards, no patrols. The shepherd didn't need them. He knew Alejandro was coming. This was a duel, not a battle. Alejandro walked across the overgrown courtyard. He remembered this place. He remembered playing soccer on this field while the guards looked the other way. He remembered the parties. He remembered the screams. He reached the main doors. They were gone, rot having eaten the wood decades ago. He stepped into the darkness. The air inside was cooler, smelling of wet stone and bat guano. Alejandro pulled his tactical light, but he didn't turn it on. He didn't want to give away his position yet. He let his eyes adjust to the gloom. Moonlight filtered in through holes in the roof, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. "Alejandro," a voice echoed. It came from the main hall. The voice was everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the concrete walls. "I am here," Alejandro said. His voice was calm. "Come to the altar," the voice said. Alejandro walked forward. His footsteps were silent on the damp floor. He moved through the shadows, a predator in his element. He entered the main hall. At the far end, where the drug lord had once built a private chapel, there was a single lantern burning. It sat on a stone block that served as an altar. Standing behind the altar was a man. He was old, but he didn't look frail. He looked like a piece of driftwood that had been hardened by the sea. His skin was leather, tanned and scarred. His hair was white, pulled back into a ponytail. He wore simple peasant clothes, a loose shirt and trousers. He didn't look like a criminal mastermind. He looked like a farmer. But Alejandro knew better. This was the shepherd, the man who had taught the cartels how to skin a man alive so he wouldn't bleed out. The man who had turned torture into a science. And sitting on the floor in front of the altar, bound by zip ties, was Elena. She was alive. She looked up as Alejandro entered the light. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. But when she saw him, a sob broke from her throat. "Alejandro!" she screamed. Alejandro didn't run to her. He couldn't. If he ran, he lost control. If he lost control, they both died. He stopped 10 feet away. He looked at her. He checked her for injuries. She was dirty, her clothes torn, but she was whole. "Let her go," Alejandro said. He didn't look at Elena. He looked at the shepherd. The shepherd smiled. He picked up the lantern and held it up, illuminating his own face. His eyes were milky, clouded with cataracts, but they seemed to see everything. "You look good, Alejandro," the shepherd said. "Expensive. The suit is Italian?" "Custom," Alejandro said. "Let her go." "You were in a rush," the shepherd tutted. "You were always in a rush. That was your problem. You wanted the world, and you wanted it yesterday." "I have the world," Alejandro said. "Do you?" The shepherd gestured around the ruined building. "You have a city, you have money, you have soldiers, but do you have your soul? Or did you sell it to buy that suit?" "I sold it to keep her safe," Alejandro said, "and I will sell it again tonight to get her out of here." The shepherd laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. "You think you can buy her freedom? With what?" "Money. I have no use for money. I am a dying man, Alejandro. What good is gold to a corpse? Then what do you want?" "I want to know if you are worthy," the shepherd said. His voice dropped, becoming hard as iron. "I watched you, Alejandro. I watched you rise. I was proud. You were the best of us, ruthless, efficient, pure. But then, you changed. You met her. You started building schools. You started paying the police instead of killing them. You started playing house." He spat on the floor. "You domesticated yourself. You became a pet, and a pet cannot lead the pack." "I am not a pet," Alejandro said, his hand drifting toward his knife. "Aren't you?" the shepherd asked. "Look at you. You are trembling. You are afraid, not for yourself, that I could respect. You are afraid for her. Love is a sickness, Alejandro. It makes you weak. It makes you vulnerable. I took her to show you that. I took her to show you that no matter how high you build your walls, the jungle always gets in." "You are wrong," Alejandro said. Love is not weakness. It is fuel. Fuel burns, the shepherd said. He reached down and pulled a machete from behind the altar. It was old, the blade pitted with rust, but the edge was silver and sharp. I am going to give you a choice, Alejandro. The shepherd stepped out from behind the altar. He stood over Elena. I will cut her throat, he said casually, as if discussing the weather. And you can go back to your city. You can be the king. You can be the monster you were meant to be. You will mourn her, yes, but you will be free. You will be strong again. Alejandro didn't move. He didn't breathe. Or, the shepherd continued, you can try to stop me, but if you try, we fight. And I am not the bishop. I am not a boy with a gun. I am the one who taught you how to hold a knife. If we fight, I might kill you. And if I kill you, she dies anyway. So choose. The saint or the husband? The king or the corpse? Elena looked up at Alejandro. She didn't speak. She didn't beg. She just looked at him with a heartbreaking trust. She knew who he was. She had seen the bruise on her face. She knew what he was capable of. Alejandro looked at the shepherd. He looked at the machete. I don't need to choose, Alejandro said. He drew his knife. The serrated blade caught the lantern light. I am both. The shepherd smiled. Good. He kicked the lantern over. The glass shattered. The flame flared up, catching the dry moss on the floor, creating a ring of fire around them. The shadows danced wildly. The shepherd lunged. He moved with a speed that defied his age. The machete whistled through the air, a blur of steel aimed at Alejandro's neck. Alejandro ducked, feeling the wind of the blade pass over his head. He slashed out with his knife, aiming for the shepherd's stomach. But the old man twisted away, fluid as water. They circled each other in the firelight. The rain drummed on the roof, a chaotic rhythm to their deadly dance. You are slow, the shepherd taunted, slashing again. The blade caught Alejandro's arm, slicing through the expensive shirt, drawing a line of blood. You are heavy with guilt. Alejandro gritted his teeth. He ignored the pain. He focused on the movement. The shepherd was fast, but he was old. He was expending energy. Alejandro had to be the stone. He had to weather the storm and wait for the break. The shepherd attacked again, a flurry of blows. Clang, clang, clang. Steel met steel as Alejandro parried, the impact vibrating up his arm. He was being driven back, step by step, away from Elena. Is this the great El Santo? The shepherd roared, his face twisted in a mask of exertion and glee. Is this the man who burned the South District? You fight like a child. He swung low, aiming for Alejandro's legs. Alejandro jumped back, but he slipped on the wet moss. He fell. Elena screamed. The shepherd stood over him, the machete raised high for the killing blow. This is mercy, Alejandro, he shouted. I am freeing you. Alejandro looked up. He saw the blade. He saw the fire. He saw the madness in the old man's eyes. And in that moment, Alejandro stopped being the king. He stopped being the husband. He became the animal. He didn't try to roll away. He kicked upward. His boot connected with the shepherd's kneecap. There was a sickening crunch. The shepherd howled, his leg buckling. The machete swing went wide, chipping the concrete floor. Alejandro was up instantly. He didn't hesitate. He tackled the old man, slamming him into the altar. The impact knocked the breath out of the shepherd. Alejandro grabbed the wrist holding the machete and slammed it against the stone. Once, twice, 3 times. The machete clattered to the floor. Alejandro punched him. It was a raw, brutal blow to the face. The shepherd slumped, dazed. Alejandro pinned him against the altar, his knife pressed against the old man's throat. "Do it!" The shepherd wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. "Do it! Show me you are still inside there. Kill me! Prove you are the monster." Alejandro stared at him. His chest was heaving. His eyes were wild. The rage was there, screaming at him to push the blade, to open the vein, to end it. It would be so easy. It would be justice. He looked at Elena. She was watching him. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the fire. She wasn't looking at the knife. She was looking at his face. She was looking for her husband. Alejandro's hand trembled. If he killed him, he proved the shepherd right. If he killed him in cold blood right here in front of her, he accepted that he was just a beast. But if he let him live? No, Alejandro whispered. He pulled the knife away. The shepherd looked confused. What? What are you doing? I am not you, Alejandro said. I am not a slave to the blood. He grabbed the shepherd by the shirt and threw him to the ground. You want to know if I am worthy? Alejandro asked, looking down at the broken old man. I am worthy because I have something to lose. You have nothing. You are just a ghost, haunting a graveyard. He turned his back on the shepherd. He walked to Elena. He knelt down and cut the zip ties. She threw her arms around him, sobbing into his bloody shirt. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair. I got you, he whispered. I got you. Behind them, the shepherd laughed. It was a low, gurgling sound. You fool, he rasped. You think it ends like this? You turn your back on a wolf? Alejandro heard the movement, the scrape of the machete on the floor. Elena's eyes went wide. Alejandro! Alejandro didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He had known. He spun, not with the knife, but with his gun. He had drawn it from his holster the moment he knelt down. He fired. One shot. The bullet hit the shepherd in the center of the chest. The old man was thrown back, slamming against the altar. He slid down to the floor, the machete falling from his hand. He looked at Alejandro. He looked surprised. You used a gun, the shepherd whispered. Alejandro stood up, helping Elena to her feet. He looked at the dying man. I am not a simple old man, Alejandro said. I am a pragmatist. The shepherd chuckled, a sound that turned into a cough. Then his head fell forward. The ghost was dead. Alejandro didn't linger. He didn't offer a prayer. He put his arm around Elena. Come, he said. Let's go home. They walked out of the cathedral. The fire behind them grew, feeding on the dry wood of the roof. By the time they reached the courtyard, the building was glowing from the inside, a furnace consuming the past. The rain had stopped. The sky to the east was turning a bruised purple. The dawn was coming. They walked down the hill in silence. The jungle was waking up. Birds were calling. The air was fresh, washed clean by the storm. When they reached the Rolls-Royce, Alejandro opened the door for her. He helped her in. He went to the trunk and pulled out a blanket he kept there. He wrapped it around her shoulders. He got into the driver's seat. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. They were bruised, bloody, shaking. He felt a hand on his arm. He looked at Elena. She was reaching out, touching his skin. She wasn't looking at the blood. She was looking at him. You came, she whispered. I will always come, he said. He started the car. The drive back to the city was different. The darkness was retreating. The sun broke over the peaks of the Andes, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. The light hit the mud on the windshield, turning it into amber. They reached the outskirts of Bogota as the city was waking up. The streets were quiet, unnaturally quiet. As they drove through the South District, Alejandro saw them. Men standing on street corners, shopkeepers opening their grates, police officers standing by their cruisers. When they saw the white Rolls-Royce, battered and covered in mud, driving down the avenue, they stopped. The men on the corners took off their hats. The police officers looked at the ground. They knew. The word had spread. The warehouse fire, the council's surrender, the disappearance of the shepherd. They knew that the truce was over. They knew that the king had returned and that he had burned the world to save his queen. By dawn, every man in the city feared for his life, not because Alejandro was killing them, but because they knew that there was absolutely nothing he wouldn't do. Alejandro didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the road. He drove past the precinct. He drove past the burnt shell of the warehouse, which was still smoking gently in the morning light. He drove up the hill to his estate. The gates were open. Diego was standing there, waiting. He had a bandage on his arm and a rifle in his hand. When he saw the car, he lowered the weapon. He didn't smile. He just nodded. It was a nod of profound respect. Alejandro parked the car in front of the house. He turned off the engine. He turned to Elena. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. She looked at him. She touched the cut on his cheek. She touched the gun at his hip. "Yes," she said honestly. "I am afraid of the world, Alejandro." She leaned in and kissed him. It was a soft, lingering kiss. "But I am not afraid of you." Alejandro closed his eyes. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 10 years. He opened his door. He walked around and opened hers. He picked her up, just like he had the night before. He carried her up the steps. The sun was fully up now. The light flooded the foyer, chasing away the shadows. Alejandro Vargas, the saint, the monster, the king, walked into his house. He carried his wife. He didn't look back at the city he ruled. He didn't look back at the jungle he had survived. He walked up the stairs, into the bedroom, and closed the door. The city outside held its breath. The wolves were silent. The shepherd was dead. And the rain, finally, had stopped.